friends, it's Gloria and welcome back to another video. I already talked about my top 10 best of the best fiction books that I read in 2021. If you haven't seen that yet, I'll link it above and below. But today I'll be talking about the best nonfiction that I read in 2021. I had the hardest time narrowing it down. I have 15 books to mention. I do have a top 10 and 5 honorable mentions. I read so many good nonfiction books this year. In total, I read 200 books and 40% were nonfiction. I had significantly more 5-star nonfiction reads than I had fiction reads. Fiction is a lot more hit or miss for me, and nonfiction I tend to have a lot more 5-star reading experiences, hence the long list today. So without further ado, let's jump into it. I'll start with my honorable mentions. These 3 were all spiritual nonfictions. So the first one is The Imperfect Disciple by Jared C. Wilson, Grace for people who can't get their act together. And then also 10 Words to Live by Jen Wilkin. Both of these I read in my real life book club with my friends. We read a chapter a week, met up, discussed, and these were fantastic books for discussion. So if you're looking for a spiritual nonfiction to discuss with other people, I would highly recommend both of these. I've since learned that these authors have a lot of other books that are also really great, so I'm excited to read more from them. This next one is not explicitly religious, but the author is Christian, and that is All Along You Were Blooming, Thoughts for Boundless Living, a collection of poetry from Morgan Harper Nichols. This is a beautiful illustrated poetry collection. It feels like a piece of art. A lot of themes on grace and love in here, and I don't read that much poetry, but I really enjoyed this one and am excited to read more poetry in the future. My next honorable mention is The Faithful Spy by John Hendrix, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Plot to Kill Hitler. This one was a graphic novel all about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life. He was a German theologian, and him and his family was involved in the plot to take down Hitler. This one was just incredibly informative. I learned a lot about Germany, learned a lot about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which I didn't know that much about before. Very curious to read more from him, as well as more of his biography, but I just thought that this was an excellent graphic novel. And the last honorable mention that I will mention is Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents by Isabel Wilkerson. This one was really hyped last year, and I'm glad I finally got to it. This one was also probably the most enlightening for me. Made me realize a lot about what's going on and why tensions still exist, particularly in the US. The author does an incredible job unpacking the caste system that existed in India, in Germany, and of course in the US with slavery. Okay, moving into my top 10. These are not ranked from 10 to 1. I couldn't do that to myself. Instead, they're in categories or groups. I have one here that I'll mention in just a second that doesn't really fit into either of these two piles. One being more history or informative, just basic facts around a particular thing. And then the second pile being autobiographical or memoirs, someone telling an experience in their life. So the first one, I guess, closer fits to memoir, but I just wanted to mention off the bat because this one isn't quite as impactful as the other ones. And that is 84 Charing Crossroad by Helene Hamp. This is a tiny little nonfiction. It is a collection of letters, and I also just found this one so wholesome and so sweet. I listened to the audiobook, which was great because you had a cast of characters that were doing the different voices, reading the different letters. Helene Hamp started a correspondence with a bookshop in London, and it is their correspondence for over 20 years, talking about different books, but then eventually they get to know each other's lives, and it is just so sweet, so wholesome. I just thoroughly enjoyed this one. Since that one was somewhat autobiographical, I'll jump into the memoirs and autobiographies. The first one I'll start with is A Fire Story by Bryan Fies. This is another graphic novel, a very immersive and interesting account of Bryan Fies' family and how they experienced a crazy wildfire in Northern California in 2017 that totally wiped out their neighborhood. This one felt very journalistic, like I was reading a newspaper article, but the illustrations alongside with it really helped and put the story together for me, and it was beautifully illustrated. The author is a cartoonist, so he illustrated it himself. The next one on the list is Stranger Care by Sarah Sentilles. This was a beautiful memoir about the foster care system, Sarah's experience trying to adopt through the foster care system. It was very sad and hard to read about the brokenness of the system, but also quite informative. She's originally from Portland, so it talked a lot about the Oregon as well as the Idaho foster care system and trying to adopt through those. I didn't fully agree with all the decisions that the author made going into trying to adopt, because I feel like they sort of set themselves up for failure, but it was still beautiful to read her experience in that. She also weaves lovely nature writing throughout. Also listen to this as an audiobook, and the author narrates it herself. Next up is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This one gets a lot of hype, and it's well deserved. This is a stunning memoir about experience being the victim in the sexual assault case in Stanford that happened in 2015. For a long time, Chanel was just known as Jane Doe, and this is finally her chance to tell her own story in her own words, and it was very tough to read, but so important. Everything from her actual assault, having a rape kit done on you, all of the possible stages of grief, mentally, physically, emotionally, what it felt like to be victimized and hated by so many because you're ruining a young man's life, and her whole experience in the court court trial as well. It was incredibly impactful. I learned so much from this. I had so much empathy for this woman, and it was just a very important story to read. Obviously very tough subjects in here about sexual assault, so only go in if you're prepared for that state of mind, but it was a very important read for me. Next in this memoir category is Will by Will Smith. I read this for Nonfiction November and I loved it. I gushed about it in my November wrap up, and I will gush about it again here. I listened to this as an audiobook, and that is the way this book was meant to be consumed, because Will Smith narrates it himself. He is an entertainer, an actor, and a musician, so it made sense that this book was very entertaining. He also talks about his upbringing, his relationship with his parents, particularly his dad and grandmother, as well as his romantic pursuits, and eventually his marriage to Jada and his kids. The overall theme felt like he was looking back at his life, learning through his experiences, reliving certain moments, and realizing what he learned from those experiences. Pick this up if you are a fan of Will Smith, otherwise you might not really care, but if you have watched any of his movies, have listened to any of his music, or know anything about him, it will be interesting. If you don't really care about the entertainment industry or him as a person, then I probably wouldn't pick this up. I will say as a warning, there is a ton of language in this book. Even though he's known to not ever rap with language in his music, he wrote this book as if he was talking, and a lot of language comes out when he's talking. It did really feel like me and Will Smith were just sitting in my living room and he was telling me his life story. But yeah, I did want to just give that warning for those that like to avoid language in books. It didn't feel overly excessive to me because it just kind of made sense with the way he was talking. But yeah, I loved learning about this, and this audiobook was easily the best audiobook experience I think I've ever listened to, and I've listened to a lot of audiobooks. And finally, in the autobiographical category, I have The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. I am so glad that I picked this book up, actually because of my Enneagram video that I made. I was reading like my Enneagram type, and this book was listed on some website, and I read it, and I'm so glad that I did. Corrie ten Boom and her family were watchmakers in Amsterdam during World War II, and she and her family hid and saved many Jews. They were involved in the resistance. Eventually they were caught and taken to concentration camps. She's the only one from her family that survived, and this book chronicles that entire experience. It was such a magnificent story, just beautifully told, beautifully written. I cried so much. This is an incredible story of faith and trusting God through everything, especially through the most horrible things one can experience. It was beautiful to read and very encouraging, and I absolutely loved this book. Okay, I have 4 books left, and I can't rank these. All of these were incredible books. All of these I learned so much from. Like, they were so impactful for me. I'll start with American Baby by Gabrielle Glaser, A Mother, a Child, and the Shadow History of Adoption. I also read this for Nonfiction November, and this one was so interesting. I learned so much about adoption, particularly in the US after World War II and beyond, what was happening culturally that shaped adoption, and one family in particular, and how they were affected by adoption, and how things were hidden and swept under the rug, and a lot of sketchy things were happening in the adoption world. It was a wonderful book, very informative, and I would recommend if you're interested in that subject matter. One of the toughest reads this year was Columbine by Dave Cullen, but boy was this well researched and well written. This book is a minute by minute, if not second by second account of the Columbine school shooting in the US, which was one of the first and one of the biggest mass school shootings in history. It happened in April of 1999. It's so sad and unfortunate to say that I live in a world where I think about school shootings and mall shootings very often, because they happen so often in the US. But I grew up going to school like being constantly aware and very vigilant that like a school shooting can happen at any moment, and that's really living in the aftermath of Columbine. This book dives into all of the events that occurred during that school shooting, and then particularly into the lives of the 2 shooters, everything that led up to them actually committing the act. It was very hard to read, very wild, incredibly uncomfortable, because you are getting the first-hand account and like diary entries and video log of the shooters and what was going on in their headspace. It also, of course, told the stories of the kids that lost their lives as well as the survivors of the shooting. This author dove into the evidence and went through it thoroughly, telling the story in such an incredible way. It was very tough, but I learned so much, and what an incredible book. Another nonfiction that just broke my heart, but I learned so much, and that was The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11 by Garrett M. Graff. I read this in September, and we had a whole live stream about it on Amanda from the Curly Readers channel. I'll link that below if you're interested in watching. But my goodness, this was a hard read, made me just sob to my core. I was really too young when 9/11 happened to have experienced it in any kind of way to remember. And growing up, of course, I knew about it, but I really was unfamiliar with the details. This book dives into all of the details. It also feels like like a minute by minute account of everything that happened, it gave me so much understanding and perspective of what was going on that day. We live in a post 9/11 world, and I was really missing the understanding that this book clarified for me, particularly with communication between the military, the president, and the different governing bodies involved during this attack. It of course talked about the Twin Towers, the different planes that crashed, as well as the Pentagon. The author is a journalist that collected thousands of oral interviews from different people that experienced 9/11 and different friends and family members of the victims as well. This book, alongside with the National Geographic documentary, was so impactful and so important, and I learned so much, and I'm very thankful that I got to read this book. And finally, the last nonfiction on this list, I'm not saying it's the best of all of these, but it is an amazing book, and that is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. I'm sure you've heard of this one. I feel like it's everywhere, and again, this book lives up to the hype. Bryan Stevenson is a lawyer and an advocate for death row inmates. He created the Equal Justice Initiative. He starts off this book by telling the story of Walter McMillan, who was a black man in Alabama, wrongfully accused of murder and put on death row. An incredibly written book. It didn't feel too dense, and the movie adaptation is also incredible. I feel like this is one of those books that can definitely be recommended to a multitude of people, very different kinds of people who read all kinds of books or don't even read, because this is that important of a story and that impactful. I love this one and would highly recommend, obviously, as I would recommend many on this list. There we go. That is the best of nonfiction books that I read in 2021. Please let me know if you've read any of those, if you have any thoughts. Again, it's totally okay if you didn't love any of the ones that I loved. We're all entitled to liking different things. I so appreciate you guys watching. Thank you for spending time with me, and I'll see you guys in another video soon. Bye!